Bear with me here, I can't get this every time. Whew. Hang on. What's up everybody? Today we are going over the exposure triangle, which is how you manually expose for your videos or photos in camera. Roll the intro. The exposure triangle is the three main settings in your camera that balance the light, movement, and focus of your image. Those three settings that make the triangle are the aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. So let's go over what each of those are and how they affect your image. So to start with the very basics of how your camera works, light enters through your lens, passing through the glass and the aperture. Then it enters the camera, passing through the shutter, and finally hitting a digital sensor, which creates your image. Now the amount of light, the frequency it hits your sensor, and your sensor's sensibility to that light changes the focus, brightness, motion, and overall quality of your image. Each of these settings can increase or decrease the brightness of your image, but they also have a counterpoint where they affect other aspects of your image. So how you adjust and balance these settings is very important. Point number one on the exposure triangle is the aperture, which is located inside your lens. The simplest way to describe it is the size of the hole that allows light to pass through your lens. Inside your lens are small metal blades that open and close and affect the amount of light that pass through it and into the camera. The bigger the hole, the more light, which makes your image brighter. The smaller the hole, the less light, which makes your image darker. The aperture is expressed by a number next to the letter F. The F stands for focal length, otherwise known as the f-stop. The confusing part about the aperture is the way that number is expressed. So the bigger the hole, the smaller the number, and the smaller the hole, the bigger the number. So big number, small hole, darker image, small number, big hole, brighter image. For example, f11 is much darker than f2.8. Now remember when I said that each point of the triangle also affects other aspects of your image? Well, the aperture also affects your depth of field. The depth of field is the amount of your image that is in focus. So f1.8 lets in a lot of light, but it has a shallow depth of field, meaning less of your image is in focus. This is used a lot for interviews or portraits when you want to focus on your subject and blur the background. So f11 would let in less light but have a deep depth of field, meaning that more of your image is in focus. This is often used in sports or landscapes where you want to see everything going on in the frame. So to summarize aperture, a big number means less light and more in focus, and a small number means more light and less in focus. So I'm actually traveling today. I'm going up to Northern California to do a shoot as well as see a bunch of family. So we will get to point number 2 at the next location. Point number 2 on the exposure triangle is the shutter speed, which controls the frequency of light that enters your camera. The shutter is this metal door that sits in front of your camera's sensor that opens and closes at different speeds to let more or less light through. The longer the shutter is open, the more light gets through and the brighter your image. Puppies. Puppies. The shutter speed is measured in seconds and in fractions of seconds. You're generally dealing with fractions of seconds for both photos and videos unless you're doing some kind of long exposure shot. The shutter speed also affects the way your camera captures motion. So the longer the shutter speed is open, the blurrier the motion. The quicker the shutter speed opens and closes, the sharper the motion. For example, let's say I have a 1 second shutter speed, then my sensor is exposed to the light for a full second, and all the motion that happens within that second will be blurred. Now, if I have a shutter speed of 1/120, meaning 120th of a second, then every little motion will be captured separately by the sensor, making the movement look clear and sharp. And since your shutter speed relates to the way your camera captures motion, it has a unique relationship to video. For video, as a rule of thumb, your shutter speed should be double your frame rate. At that ratio, your camera captures motion in the most pleasing way to the eye. So if you set your frame rate to 24 frames per second, 30 frames per second, or 60 frames per second, you just double that number and set your shutter to that. That is a general rule to create the most natural motion blur, but you can play around with the shutter speed to get more creative shots. For example, if you lower your shutter speed, you can create more motion blur and make a dreamlike sequence or make it look like your character's tripping out on something. And if you higher your shutter speed in relation to the frame rate, that creates less motion blur, making the movements look sharper and quicker. A lot of action scenes and car chases are filmed this way to create that effect. So to summarize point 2, the shorter the shutter speed. So to summarize point 2 on the exposure triangle, the shorter the shutter speed, the less light and the less motion blur. The higher the shutter speed, the more light and the more motion blur. So point number 3 on the exposure triangle is the ISO. And what the ISO is the sensor inside your camera, and that sensor's sensitivity to light. So the ISO is expressed by a number, and normally that number is between 100 and, depending on the camera, goes up into the high thousands. So unlike the other 2 points, the ISO is very simple, where the larger the number, the more sensitive to light, meaning the brighter the image. And the smaller the number, the less sensitive that sensor is to the light coming through, so the darker the image. Now, like the other 2 points, the ISO also affects another part of your image. So the higher your ISO number is, meaning the more sensitivity and the more light you let into your shot, the more grain or noise you have in your image. So each camera has a native ISO, and what that is how high you can crank up your ISO without bringing too much grain or noise into your image. So for some cameras that's 800, for some cameras that's 6400. You know, it just depends on the model that you have. For my Sony a7 III, it's around 800 for video. I always try to stay in between 100 and 800 ISO and not go much higher than that, or else there'll be some noise and grain in the picture. So make sure to check out what the native ISO is for your camera and try not to go above that number. Also, in general, the native ISO is higher for photography than it is for video, so you can crank it up a little more if you're shooting stills. We did it. Those are the 3 points of the exposure triangle, and how you balance them will create the proper exposure as well as control the focus, motion blur, and image quality. So learning to mix these 3 settings to create the look that you want is the foundation of cinematography and a great place to start. There are other ways to affect your exposure, like using an ND filter, which I'm using right now, or lighting the scene, which gives you much more flexibility, but we'll talk about those in another video. The other really cool thing about learning this is that it's the same for every camera. So once you learn it once, you know it for all the cameras out there, and it's just figuring out where the different buttons are on the different models. So now you know all 3 points of the exposure triangle, so you are a cinematographer. Sweet! Get that camera into manual mode, go out, shoot something, and I'll see you next week. Guess that's it.